Good morning. Even people standing, good Lord. First of all, I would like to apologize on behalf of Gabriella, our Chief of Staff, that she couldn't make it. There was a rescheduling in the meeting of the councils, the executive board of the OECD, so to speak, and she had to be there. I know the topic is close to her heart, so she really wanted to go, but she couldn't make it, so I apologize. The good news is, of course, that I'll be able to bring some gender balance to the panel. I don't know, what about the PowerPoint? Can that be put up? That's it. That's a good starting point for my expose this morning. We're talking about STEM, but why are we talking about STEM? We're talking about work-life balance, but why are we talking about work-life balance? What are the economic drivers, the demands in future as well as today? And let's look first of all at the current position at the labour market from a gender perspective. And then you will see that in all OECD countries, men are much more likely to participate in the labour market than women. On average, the gap is about 12 percentage points across the OECD, and you can see that in Asia, that gap is larger. Yes, almost 20% in Korea, a little bit less in Japan. In China, where, of course, until the reforms of about 20 years ago, the gap, at least in nominal terms, was much smaller. So that means that a lot of people who could be participating in the labour market and who could be contributing to economic growth are not. It's a great thing when it works. There you go. So let me show you the implications of the current labour market situation to continue. And look at the blue line. The blue line is what we call the baseline scenario. It is based on the 5-year cohort labour market entry and exit codes for the last 15 years. So we look back at the past and project that in the future. And then you'll see that in countries like Germany and Japan, the labour force will decline. And that is, of course, because the working age population is getting smaller, and at the current labour force participation rates, that means that you will see a decline in labour supply and in GDP. So growth, GDP will go down and growth will slow down. So one of the issues is then, of course, to increase the participation of those who are currently underrepresented in the labour market, women. And there are various initiatives to do that. One of the initiatives is the G20 initiative to reduce the target, to reduce the gender gap in labour force participation by 25% in 2025. And that's the first dotted line. You can see that for Japan, that would already lead to an increase in labour supply and in the labour force. In other countries where the demographic trends are not as bad as in Japan, as in the US, it will lead to a greater increase, as in Korea, where the working age population will decline a little bit later than in Japan. The situation in Germany is similar to that in Japan. If you could halve the gender gap by 50% in 2025, you can see that labour supplies will increase much more. That would actually lead to an annual increase of GDP growth of 0.25% for Japan. Hence, you guys have a very good, strong economic case for increasing female labour force participation. And this abstracts, of course, from the fact that at present women are more likely to work fewer hours than men. So if you would look at the inequality in the intensity of working hours, you could make further gains. And as we will see later on, women, on average, have a higher level of educational attainment than men. So in terms of productivity, you could also make gains. One of the current outcomes, which is pretty bad in terms of gender perspective is earnings and pay structures across genders, and you can see that the gender pay gap in Japan is, and Korea on the right-hand side is well above the OECD average of about 15%. And this is related to a lot of women working in non-regular employment in Japan, concentrated in certain sectors where pay is relatively low, and not making the wage gains which many regular male workers are making. And you see a similar pattern in Korea, whereas the differences in Europe, while persistent, are not as large. But even in Europe, you have the issue that women are concentrated in certain occupations and are less likely to make it to the top. The glass ceiling remains everywhere. This is the share of female share of women on boards of large companies listed at the stock market. And you can see that in France and Sweden, this is getting close to 40%. There have been, in recent years, a lot of political initiatives in this area, either disclosure requirements, target setting by companies, and in some countries like Norway, but also Germany and France, people have moved towards a mandatory quota on the gender balance on boards. You can see that in France and Sweden, as I said, it's above 30%. In Germany, it is getting there. The UK, which has a different approach, a more voluntary approach, over the last 10, 15 years, has also got there. So, I mean, it's not said that a quota is necessarily the only way of trying to improve the situation. The OECD average around 20%, but you can see that female representation in the top echelons of companies in Japan and Korea is relatively low. Of course, this is related to the choices people made and the attitudes that were in society about 30, 40 years ago. Because a lot of the labor market choices that were made then affect the current labor market outcomes. And if you're 55, as I almost am, then my position is also determined by the choices I made 30, 35 years ago. So you have to think about it. And it was a different society where attitudes were different. And that comes to the next point, attitudes. Attitudes are difficult to change. It takes time to change them. But they are very important in the outcomes that you've just seen. Because when it comes to ability, and when you test young students of around 15 years of age, as we do in the OECD PISA test, you see that across the 65 countries that are participating in the test, you will see that in all these countries, young girls do better, on average, in reading literacy scores across the board, all countries. In about 35 countries, boys do better in mathematics. But their gain, on average that is, their gain over women, over young girls, is not as large as the gap in reading literacy scores. So at that age, you would say that young girls score better on average than young boys. So here, on the left-hand side, you see Korea. There is a gap. This is a male minus female. So if you're below the line, the women, the men do better. Hang on, male minus female. Let's get this straight. So this one is positive. So the men do better in mathematics, as you can see in these countries. In these countries, even the boys underperform girls on average in mathematics, and everywhere the girls do better than the boys. In all the charts, I've taken about 10 countries, otherwise it becomes unreadable. As I said, PISA has 65 countries, the OECD has 35 countries. It becomes painful to look at. But the story remains the same. At this age, women, girls do better. This is reflected in the tertiary graduation rates. And you can see that in all countries, 25, 34-year-olds, among the 25, 34-year-olds, women are more likely to have obtained a tertiary university degree than young men. The gap in Japan is relatively small, but in other countries, except for China and Germany, the gap is considerable. So, on the whole, the female part of the population is better educated. But one of the things which remains different in the gender area, in the gender education area, is the choice of topic that women pursue at school and at university. And here you see that women, I've taken here science, maths, and computing. The gender gap is particularly large in computing. The gender gap is smaller in science because it includes natural sciences, biology, medicine. But you can see that in these three categories, on the whole, about 35% of the graduates are female, and in Japan, that share is even lower. And that has nothing to do with ability. It has to do with the choices you make and the attitudes you make at school, the choices, and also at home, of course. So this evidence that saying, right, you know, in terms of ability, young girls do as good as boys, or if not better, in PISA literacy scores and in tertiary attainment. So why are they not equally represented or even overrepresented in STEM areas? Contributed to the G7 decision to at the Ise summit to initiate the WINS initiative, about which I'm not going to talk anything, as there are two representatives of that initiative here who will discuss this later. But across the OECD, a lot of countries are trying to undertake initiatives to get young women to think, at least, about pursuing a STEM career. There are the oldest probably is the Go Mint one in Germany. There is the Ricocello Support Partners program initiative in Japan. There is US Department of Education gives higher grants to states when they try to promote underrepresented groups among women, women among them, I should say, in their educational programs. So there's a lot of initiatives to try and get more young women to choose STEM. There's, of course, a lot of policy support for this, because, you know, if you get women to choose more STEM, and if you want them to pursue their labor market opportunities, then for both fathers and mothers, it is crucial to have childcare supports. This is what you need to increase labor force participation rates among parents. And you can see that Japan and Korea do not do particularly badly. They're quite close to the OECD average. Not as close to top countries in terms of childcare coverage like France and Sweden. But the gap isn't that large. Particularly impressive for Korea, because they have developed their childcare system, really expanded it over the last 10, 15 years. And coverage has, over the last 10 years, tripled or quadrupled. So, particularly in Korea, over the past 10 years, there's been a lot of public support, public investment in early childcare supports. Another one is, of course, the problem with gender equality very often is men. I mean, nothing new there. So what do governments try to do? They try to change behavior among men, and a very good point in time to do that is when young children are born, because then you may actually effectuate a change with long-lasting effects. And so you've seen that in the OECD, there are now about 10 countries who have, in one way or another, the rules and regulations vary across countries, but who provide income support to fathers for about 8 to 10 weeks at least, just to try and generate change in behavior. And you can see here that the longest periods are in Japan and Korea. So basically, in terms of policy development, policymakers are aware that they need to change behavior among men so that men and women feel right about having children. Because, of course, this is a big policy issue in Asian countries, the persistently low fertility rates. This is not an issue which plays in the Netherlands, in my own country. The government says, right, that's not our business, we stay well out of that. But this is, of course, a key important policy driver in Asia, which you have to keep in the back of your mind also when you're discussing gender issues. That you have this very generous system does not mean that it is used. So Japanese workers do not feel, Japanese regular workers who might be entitled to a year of leave, do not feel that it is good for their career to take the leave. So very few men do so. Same in Korea, but there is some change. About 10 years ago, about 1% of the entitled men took it. These days, that is over 5%. And if a man in Korea takes this leave, he takes it on average for 8 months. So that's not bad. And that is a considerable change in a very short period of time. You can see that in other countries, Sweden and Germany is another country with a lot of change over the past 10 years. And now, of the babies who are born, about 1/3 of their fathers takes this paid parental leave. Whereas that was much smaller, it was half of that 10 years ago. So these policy initiatives can have an effect, but it takes some time before they do have that effect. But of course, it's not just policy which needs to change. Even if social policy change, what needs to be changed to make it effective is the workplace culture. That cannot be ordered by the government. It is employers, unions, who have to think about these things, who have to make agreements on things. And in terms of workplace culture, particularly in Japan and Korea, compared to other OECD countries, the culture is not very conducive to combining work with care responsibilities. Long hours in Japan, socializing after work, when are you going to change a nappy? It's just not going to happen. So you have to change that culture. Regular workers have to feel confident that taking leave, even their annual holiday entitlement in full, does not harm their career. And the various measures that could be taken in companies, leadership is very important. Middle management might be made responsible for workers taking their leave entitlement. You can think about the rules of the distinction in the rules between non-regular and regular workers, which would be particularly important to get back the women who have withdrawn from the labor force to care for children, to get them back into the labor force. Because if they can only get back to a low-paid, non-regular job, why bother? So you have to make it attractive financially to get them back into the labor force. And there is, of course, a business case for a certain group of high-skilled workers which will make, which companies could look at in order to attract these workers. And that's why many multinational companies are much more, are preferred by a lot of Japanese and Korean workers because their secondary conditions are better than in many Japanese firms. So there's a whole a lot of things to think about which cannot be ordered or mandated by the state, but on which employees, associations, unions, and employers have to take their responsibility. Just to conclude, the OECD will continue its work on gender issues. We've just released a gender review of Mexico. About 10 days ago, we released Dare to Share. Germany is a country where the government undertakes a lot of initiatives to get a more equal sharing of paid and unpaid work in couple families. So in Germany, there's a lot of part-time work by mothers, and fathers work over 40 hours per week. The government tries to rebalance that outcome and have fathers somewhat reduce their hours and women participate more intensively in the labor force. This is a sea change in policy compared to 10 years ago. So since the mid-2000s, with the appearance of Ms. Merkel, you have seen a great focus on the development of work-life balance supports in Germany, in terms of childcare, in terms of parental leave, in terms of flexible working hours. We support the ongoing work for the G20 and the G7. The German authorities, you may recall that I mentioned the G20 target of the reduction of the gender pay gap. German authorities want to enrich that target with a greater emphasis on the quality of employment, and we're working on some indicators on that. For the Italian G7 presidency, they also would like to include a gender focus in their work this year. Past G7 work included a focus on entrepreneurship. That was the German G7, and the WINS STEM work in the Isushima summit. We finally have to report on the gender recommendation. The OECD gender recommendation was adopted in 2013, and we have to report to ministers at their meeting on 7-8 June whether there has been any progress made. We're working on that report, and we hope to get that out in time for those dates. So we will keep pushing this because there's a strong economic case, which I hope I've clearly outlined. And I thank you very much for your attention and for your invitation to being here.